The closing of the door was the sound of a world ending. It was not a slam, but a quiet, final click of the latch, a sound of oiled metal and settled wood that was more damning than any shout. On one side of that door was the home where Olara had been born. On the other was Olara, 19 years old, with the dust of the road already settling on the hem of her worn dress. Her Uncle Silas had not looked at her as he'd pressed the coins into her palm. His gaze was fixed on the hearth, on the fire that was now his, in the house that was now his. "The law is the law, Ilara," he had said, his voice flat and practiced, as if he had rehearsed the words in front of a mirror. The men from the town of Providence stood behind him, their faces a mixture of pity and discomfort. Mr. Gable, who owned the mercantile, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He had known her father for 20 years. Now he watched as her father's only child was turned out. The will was clear, Silas had explained. The farm, the livestock, the house, it all passed to him, the only male heir. Ilara's inheritance was a different matter. A joke, her father had called it, purchased in a fit of whimsy years ago. A deed to 40 acres in the Barrens, a place of wind-bitten rock and stunted juniper trees where nothing grew and no one lived. She looked down at her hands. In one the deed, a brittle piece of paper that felt as useless as a dead leaf. In the other, $20 in coin, heavy, cold, and not nearly enough. She also had the clothes she wore, a thick wool blanket her mother had woven, and her father's axe, its hickory handle worn smooth by his grip. Silas had allowed her that. An act of charity, he'd called it. The axe was her only link to the man who had taught her how to read the clouds and listen to the land. Everything else was gone. "You should take the morning coach east," Mr. Gable offered, his voice low so Silas wouldn't hear the advice. "Find work in a factory. A girl can't make a life out here alone, especially not up there." He gestured vaguely toward the northern bluffs, a place children were told stories about to keep them from wandering too far. Ilara looked at his soft hands, at the clean collar of his shirt. He meant to be kind, but his words were just another closing door. He saw a victim, a pitiable orphan to be sent away. He could not see the quiet fire her father had stoked in her, a stubborn refusal to break. She didn't answer him. She turned her back on the house, on the faces of the men who had watched her dispossession in silence. She walked the 2 miles into Providence, the weight of the axe in one hand and the coins in the other, feeling like the last 2 anchors in a storm-tossed sea. In her mind, she saw the map from the deed. She knew the place. A fissure in a limestone cliff, facing north into the teeth of the prevailing winter wind. A worthless, forsaken place. At Gable's mercantile, the whispers followed her down the aisles. She ignored them. She did not buy a coach ticket. She walked past the ribbons and the candies and the pretty things meant for girls with futures. She went to the tools. She bought a shovel with a sturdy ash handle. She bought a small cast-iron pot, a sack of flour, another of beans, and a block of salt. The purchases ate almost all of her $20. Mr. Gable tallied the cost, his expression grim. "This is a mistake, child," he murmured, handing her a few remaining coins. "This land is mine," she said. It was the only thing she had said to anyone since leaving the farm. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. She shouldered the shovel, gathered her meager supplies, and walked out of the store. She did not look back. She walked north, away from the town, away from the pitying eyes and the soft advice. She walked toward the Barrens, her shadow stretching long behind her in the afternoon sun. The choice had been made. She would not flee. She would go to her worthless land, and she would make it yield. The journey was a punishment. The first day was across the familiar, gentle hills of the valley, but by afternoon the land began to change. The soil grew thin, giving way to shale and rock. The trees became smaller, twisted into shapes of permanent struggle against the wind. The weight of the shovel and the sack of provisions dug into her shoulders, raw and unforgiving. She walked until dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, then wrapped herself in her mother's blanket and slept in the meager shelter of a rock outcropping, the cold ground leaching the warmth from her bones. The second day was worse. The path vanished, and she was climbing through stony bluffs, the landscape stark and hostile. The wind was a constant companion, a thief that stole her breath and chilled her to the core. The isolation was a physical presence, pressing in on all sides. There were no birds here, no signs of life beyond the hardy, lichen-covered stones. By the time she found the iron surveyor's stake that marked the corner of her property, her hope was as thin and brittle as the deed in her pocket. And then she saw it. It was not a cave, not even a proper overhang. It was a wound in the face of a great limestone cliff, a shallow, north-facing depression maybe 20 feet wide and 8 feet deep at its center. The ground inside was a jumble of fallen rock and hard-packed, sterile dirt. The wind, channeled by the surrounding bluffs, howled directly into it. It was a funnel for the cold. Mr. Gable had been right. Her uncle had been right. This place was a tomb waiting for a body. For a long moment, Alara stood there, the weight of it all crashing down on her. The injustice, the grueling journey, the stark reality of this forsaken place. Her knees felt weak. The sting in her eyes was not from the wind. Despair was a cold, heavy thing, and it settled deep in her gut. She had traded her last dollars for a shovel to dig her own grave. She slid down against the back wall of the depression, huddling to escape the relentless wind, and closed her eyes. It was over. She had failed before she had even begun. But as she sat there, a strange sensation began to creep through the layers of her exhaustion. The rock at her back was not cold. It was not frozen like the ground she had slept on the night before. It was neutral. She pressed her bare palm flat against the limestone. A subtle, steady warmth radiated from it, a deep earth energy that was ancient and alive. It was not hot, but it was a world away from the biting cold of the air. Her eyes opened. She scanned the rock face, and then she saw the second miracle. Near the floor, from a tiny fissure, a single drop of water emerged, glistened for a moment, and fell. It was followed by another and another. A slow, constant seep of clean water, pooling in a small, stone-lined hollow. The wind howled past the mouth of the depression, but inside, in the lee of the rock, the air was still. Warmth, water, shelter from the wind. The three pillars of survival. They were here. The town was wrong. The land was not worthless. It held a secret. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, pushed back by a grim, fierce resolve. She got to her feet, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of the shovel. The work would be brutal. It might kill her. But now, for the first time, she believed it might not. The first task was to deepen the wound. She began to dig. The ground was a stubborn enemy, a dense mix of clay and stone that fought every thrust of the shovel. She used her father's axe to break up the larger rocks, the shock of each blow traveling up her arms and into her shoulders. The work was a rhythm of violence, the sharp crack of the axe, the grating scrape of the shovel, the dull thud of earth tossed aside. Blisters rose on her palms, broke and bled, leaving her hands raw and burning. Every muscle screamed in protest. She worked from dawn until she could no longer see, fueled by a cold fury and small handfuls of dry beans. She did not think of her uncle or the town. She thought only of the next shovelful, the next stone to be pried loose. She was not just digging a hole. She was carving out a space to live in a world that had told her there was no space left. Slowly, painstakingly, the depression deepened. An inch, then a foot. She clawed her way deeper into the earth, creating a sunken floor that was already more protected from the wind. The stones she unearthed became her allies. She sorted them by size, her raw hands learning the feel of their weight and balance. The large, flat ones she set aside. These would be her walls. She began to stack them at the front of the dugout, building two thick, low walls that extended from the cliff face, enclosing the space she had cleared. It was a puzzle of 1,000 pieces with no instructions. A wall would collapse, and she would rebuild it, her patience worn to a thread. But she learned. She learned how a small stone could wedge a larger one into place, how to stagger the seams for strength. The walls rose a few inches each day, a testament to pure, relentless effort. The water seep led her to another discovery. As she cleared the area around it, she found a thick, rich deposit of gray clay. She remembered her father mixing a similar clay with straw to patch the chimney of their old smokehouse. She dug out handfuls of it, mixed it with water from the seep and dry grass, and kneaded it with her feet until it was a thick, sticky mortar. With this, she filled the gaps between the stones of her wall. The wind had been a constant whisper through the cracks. Now there was silence. The walls were sealed. For the roof, she needed timber. There was a small, sheltered copse of hardy pines about a half-mile away. Felling a tree with nothing but an axe was a new kind of exhaustion. She chose a small one, no thicker than her thigh, and began to chop. The axe felt clumsy in her blistered hands. It took hours of rhythmic, body-jarring work to bring it down. Then came the harder part, hauling it back to her shelter. She dragged it, inch by agonizing inch, her body straining against the dead weight. It took her 4 days to fell and haul 5 logs, but when she finally laid them across the top of her stone walls, spanning the gap to the cliff face, a feeling of grim triumph washed over her. She wove a dense mat of branches over the logs, then covered the entire structure with the earth and sod she had excavated. Her roof was a living part of the hill itself. She built a door from the leftover timbers, a crude, heavy thing that fit poorly but blocked the worst of the wind. The day she first closed it behind her, the world outside vanished. There was no wind, only a deep, profound quiet. The air inside was cool but not cold, smelling of damp earth and stone. The only light came from the open doorway. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a sanctuary. Her next focus was heat. The back wall provided a constant, low-grade warmth, but for the deep winter she would need fire. She identified a natural crack in the limestone high up on the cliff face above her dugout. A chimney waiting to be used. She built a small hearth against one of the interior stone walls, carefully constructing a flue that angled up and back, aiming for that fissure. It took several attempts, with smoke filling the dugout and stinging her eyes, before she got the draw right. The first time a steady plume of smoke rose from the hearth and vanished up the flue, unseen from the outside, she wept with relief. The stone of the walls and the earth of the floor became a thermal mass, soaking up the heat from the fire and the geothermal warmth, holding it and radiating it back into the small space. Water was life. She carefully enlarged the hollow where the water seeped, digging it out to form a small basin. She lined it meticulously with her gray clay, firing it with hot coals from her hearth until it was hard as pottery. The result was a small, clean cistern inside her home, providing a constant supply of fresh water that never froze. The final piece was food. She could not live on beans and flour forever. She had noticed a small, sheltered patch of rich black soil in a ravine a mile from her dugout. Over the course of a week, she undertook the most back-breaking task yet. Using her now empty flour sack, she hauled that soil, one heavy load at a time, back to her home. Inside, against the geothermally warm back wall, she built a long, shallow trough of stone and clay and filled it with the precious earth. In this subterranean garden, protected from frost and wind, in the dim light supplemented by a simple wick burning in a bowl of rendered animal fat, she planted the few potato eyes and carrot seeds she had thought to buy. It was a desperate gamble, an act of faith in the secret warmth of the rock. After 2 months of this solitary, brutal labor, she knew she needed more. She needed a source of protein that would sustain itself. She needed animals. Taking only her axe and a small sack with a bit of dried meat, she walked back to Providence. The town was a shock to her system. The noise, the people, the smells. She had grown accustomed to silence and the scent of stone and pine. Her appearance caused a stir. She was gaunt, her face browned by the wind, her hands calloused and scarred. Her clothes were tattered and stained with dirt and clay. The women averted their eyes, the men stared. The whispers followed her to the mercantile. "The Folly girl," they murmured. "Still alive, is she?" Mr. Gable's eyes widened when she walked in. He saw the new hardness in her, the way she stood, her back straight, her gaze direct. She did not browse. She walked to the counter and used the last of her money to buy 3 laying hens and a tiny squealing piglet. She also bought a sack of feed. "Elara, what are you thinking?" Gable pleaded, his voice a low hiss. "You have no barn. The wolves will take them the first night. They'll freeze before the first snow." "I have a place for them," she said, her voice steady. She paid him, hefted the sack of feed, and tucked the piglet under one arm, the crate with the chickens in the other. She walked out of the store, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The journey back was a trial. The chickens squawked, and the piglet wriggled, making the trek even more difficult. It was on this journey that she found her companion, a dog, thin as a whip, with ribs showing through its dusty gray coat, began to follow her. It was a stray, drawn by the scent of the piglet, its yellow eyes wary and intelligent. It kept its distance, a shadow flitting between the rocks. That night, Elara shared a piece of her precious meat. She tossed it on the ground, and the dog snatched it up, retreating to the darkness to eat. It did not leave. It followed her all the way back to the dugout. When she arrived exhausted, the dog sat 20 yards away, watching. She named him Shale. Inside the dugout she had already prepared a space. She built a small stone-walled pen in the warmest corner near the back wall. It was here the animals would live, their own body heat adding to the warmth of the shelter. Shale, after 2 days of cautious observation, finally crept inside during a cold rainstorm, curling up as far from her as he could get. That night she woke to his low growl. Outside she heard the cry of a wolf. The dog had chosen his home. He was her guardian now, her only companion in the vast, silent world she inhabited. The story of the Folly girl and her absurd purchase became a favorite piece of town gossip. It solidified her status as a fool, a stubborn girl courting her own demise. The most vocal critic was a young trapper named Brant. He was known for his arrogance, a man who believed his skill with a rifle and a trap made him an expert on all matters of survival. He considered her an insult to the hard-won wisdom of the frontier. One day, he rode out to her land, curious to see the source of the legend. He found her outside, splitting firewood, Shale a silent, bristling presence at her side. Brant took in the low, sod-covered roof, the crude stone facade barely visible against the cliff. He laughed, a loud, condescending sound that echoed off the rocks. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head as he sat high on his horse. "The town wasn't exaggerating. You've dug yourself a grave." He gestured with his chin toward the entrance. "That hole will be your tomb come the first deep freeze, girl. The rocks will sweat with cold, and you'll die of lung fever before you ever starve." He spat on the ground. "Best pray for a mild winter." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving his laughter hanging in the cold air. Elara watched him go, then turned back to her work, the rhythmic thud of her axe on wood, her only reply. Winter did not arrive gently. It came in stages, each a test of her systems. First came the freezing rains that turned the world to glass. Inside her dugout she was dry and warm. The sod roof, soaked with water, became an even better insulator. Then came the first snows, blanketing the land in a pristine, deadly silence. The town of Providence hunkered down, the smoke from their chimneys the only sign of life. Ilara's chimney, hidden in the rock face, vented its smoke almost invisibly, a thin wisp that vanished into the gray sky. Her days fell into a deep, monastic routine. She would wake in the near darkness, the only light the faint glow of embers in the hearth. The first task was always the fire, adding wood, coaxing it back to life. Then came the animals. She fed the chickens and the growing pig, their soft noises a comforting presence in the quiet. She collected the eggs, 2 or 3 a day, each one a small, perfect miracle. She tended her garden, a patch of impossible green in a world of white. The potatoes and carrots grew slowly but steadily in the warm earth. Her world was small, but it was whole. The sound of the wind screaming over the bluffs was a constant reminder of the world she had shut out. Inside, there was the gentle crackle of the fire, the rustle of the animals, the quiet panting of Shale asleep at her feet. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom of stone and earth, a world she had built with her own 2 hands. The smaller tests continued. A pack of wolves, driven by hunger, found her shelter. They clawed at the heavy wooden door, their howls filling the night. Shale's ferocious barking from within was the only warning she had. She braced the door with a heavy log and waited, her heart pounding. The stone walls held, the door held. In the morning, there were only tracks in the snow. Later, a small rockfall, dislodged by a freeze-thaw cycle, cascaded down the cliff face. It struck her roof with a dull thud and slid off the thick layer of sod and earth, causing no damage. Each test she survived hardened her resolve and deepened her faith in the sanctuary she had built. Then came the blizzard of '83. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It began not with snow, but with a wind that had a voice, a high, shrieking moan that scoured the land. The temperature plummeted. Any exposed skin froze in minutes. Then the snow began, driven horizontally so thick it erased the world, reducing visibility to nothing. It was a white hurricane, a relentless assault of cold and fury. Inside Ilara's dugout, the world was still. The roar of the storm was a distant, muted thing, a beast raging against walls it could not breach. The geothermal warmth from the back wall kept the temperature stable. The fire in the hearth burned with a steady, efficient glow, its heat absorbed and radiated by the tons of stone and earth surrounding her. Her cistern was full. Her animals were calm, dozing in their pen. The green shoots in her garden were untouched. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach, an island of warmth and life in an ocean of frozen death. In Providence, the world was ending. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was being shattered. The sturdy wooden houses, built to withstand normal winters, groaned and cracked under the force of the wind. Snow, fine as sand, blasted through every crack, forming drifts inside homes. Roofs, not built for such a weight of snow, began to sag and collapse. Mr. Gable's grand mercantile, the pride of the town, lost its large plate glass window. The wind burst in like a physical blow, and the building was gutted, its contents buried and ruined in moments. Families huddled together in their freezing homes, their firewood, stored in outdoor sheds, now buried under 10 feet of snow. The livestock in the barns, the town's wealth and future, began to die, their bodies freezing solid where they stood. The community's confidence, its faith in its own durability, was breaking apart. They were trapped, isolated, and dying, victims of the very environment they thought they had tamed. On the 3rd day of the storm, a new sound cut through the muted roar of the wind, a frantic, desperate scratching at her door. Shale erupted, his barks sharp and furious. Ilara's hand went to the heavy wooden bar she used to secure the door. Her first thought was of a wolf or a bear, driven mad by the storm. But the scratching was joined by a weak, human banging. Holding a burning piece of wood as a torch, she cautiously lifted the bar and pulled the heavy door inward just a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp. A figure, more a shape of ice and snow than a man, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the earthen floor. Shale stood over him, growling, the fur on his back rigid. Ilara pushed the door shut, barring it against the raging storm. She knelt beside the figure, holding the torch closer. As she brushed the ice from his face, she saw who it was. Brant. The trapper who had mocked her, who had called her home a tomb. He was barely recognizable. His face was a mask of frozen agony, his lips blue. One of his hands was black and swollen with frostbite. He was dying. For a fleeting second, his words echoed in her mind. "This hole will be your tomb." A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered within her. He had been wrong, she had been right. But the feeling was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the stark reality of the half-dead man on her floor. His suffering was not a victory. It was a tragedy. He coughed, a ragged, painful sound. His eyes, barely open, fixed on her. "Help," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Lena, the baby." He gasped for air. "Cabin, fire's out. 2 days." He was trying to get to town for help, he explained in broken phrases. He had gotten lost in the whiteout, wandering for hours, certain he was going to die. Then he saw it, a faint, almost invisible wisp of heat rising from the rocks, her chimney. A ghost of a sign that had led him here. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. His wife and child were dying. She looked at her carefully rationed firewood, her stores of food. Helping him, helping them, would put a strain on everything. It was a risk. But to leave a woman and child to freeze was unthinkable. It was not in her. She had not built this life only to watch others die at her doorstep. She moved with purpose. First, she ladled warm broth from the pot simmering by the fire and forced Brant to drink, the heat reviving him slightly. She gently wrapped his blackened hand in clean rags. Then she prepared for the rescue. She had built a small, sturdy sled from leftover timbers for hauling firewood. She loaded it with her precious fuel, blankets, and several stones she had heated in the fire, wrapped in thick cloth to hold their warmth. She tied one end of a long rope she had woven from vines around her waist. The other end she secured firmly to the inside of her door frame. It was her only lifeline. Outside, the world was a howling, formless chaos. To get lost would be to die in minutes. With Shale at her side, his instincts, her best guide, she opened the door and plunged into the storm, pulling the sled behind her, following the faint trail Brant had left, a path that was already vanishing under the onslaught of the blizzard. The journey was a waking nightmare. The wind was a solid wall she had to push through. The snow blinded her, and the cold was a physical pain that burned in her lungs. Twice she fell, losing her grip on the sled, only finding her way back by following the rope. Shale was a phantom ahead of her, his dark shape occasionally visible, his bark cutting through the wind, urging her on. It was a journey of a few miles that felt like 100. They found the cabin buried, a mere mound in the snow. She had to dig her way to the door. Inside, it was colder than the air outside. Lena was huddled in a corner, wrapped in every blanket she owned, her infant son held tight against her chest. Neither of them was moving much. Their breathing was shallow. Ilara worked frantically, her numb fingers struggling to light a fire in the frozen hearth. The dry wood she had brought caught quickly. As warmth began to creep back into the small, dark space, Lena started to weep, silent tears freezing on her cheeks. Ilara warmed the hot stones and placed them around the mother and child. She fed them both warm broth she had carried in a sealed jar. It was not enough. They were too far gone. They would not survive the night here, even with the fire. The only hope was to take them back. The journey back was even more perilous. with Alara now supporting Lena, who carried the baby, while Shale guided them through the maelstrom. When they finally stumbled back through the door of the dugout, they were not just entering a shelter, they were entering another world. The warmth was the first thing that struck them, a deep, steady, enveloping heat that seemed to come from the very walls. After the screaming wind, the silence was absolute. As their eyes adjusted to the lamplight, they saw it all, the neat rows of green vegetables growing against the far wall, the chickens stirring in their pen, the pig grunting softly, the orderly stacks of firewood, the clean cistern of water, the shelves lined with preserved food. They stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. This was not the hovel of a mad girl. This was not a tomb. It was an ark, a self-contained world of life and order, thriving in the heart of a frozen apocalypse. Brant, propped against the wall, watched his wife and child being saved. He looked at Alara, who was calmly tending to the baby, wrapping him in a warm, dry blanket. His arrogance was gone, stripped away by the storm and by the undeniable truth of what he was seeing. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse with shame. "We called you the folly girl," he said, his words barely a whisper. "We laughed at you." He shook his head, a tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "We were the fools. My God, we were all fools." Alara looked up at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, weary compassion. She handed Lena a mug of broth. "There is food. Eat," she said simply. "Your son needs you strong." Her grace, offered in that moment, was more powerful and more humbling than any rebuke could ever have been. She did not need to point out their error. The proof was all around them, in the warmth of the air and the taste of the food. She had built her vindication from stone and earth, and it needed no further argument. When the great blizzard finally broke, the world was remade in white and silence. The survivors of Providence emerged from their shattered homes into a landscape of devastation. The town was crippled. Many had died. Their confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling fear of the land they lived on. Brant, his hand crudely but effectively treated by Alara, guided a small party of the town's leading men, including a haggard Mr. Gable, out to the barrens. They came not with scorn, but with a desperate hope. They found Alara, her family of survivors, and her impossible home. The men stood in the entrance of the dugout, their hats in their hands, utterly speechless. They saw the systems, the warmth, the life. They understood, in a sudden and profound way, how deeply wrong they had been. The nickname, the Folly Girl, died on that day, never to be spoken again. From then on, when people spoke of her home, they called it the hearth, a place of warmth and life in the heart of the stone. Alara shared her knowledge without hesitation or price. She showed them the secret of the earth's warmth, the logic of the thermal mass. She explained how she built with stone and sod, not just wood. She taught them how to site a structure to be sheltered from the wind, not exposed to it. The people of Providence listened, their arrogance replaced by a student's humility. The town rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. The new houses were dug into the hillsides with thick stone foundations and living sod roofs. Community cellars, deep and warm, were constructed based on her design, large enough to shelter families and livestock. They learned to work with the land, not against it. The hard-won lessons of that winter, purchased with so much loss, were etched into the very architecture of the new town. Ilara's worthless plot of land had become the cornerstone of their survival, and her methods, once mocked as foolishness, were now their founding principles. Her story traveled, carried by traders and trappers, a tale of resilience that gave hope to other settlements in the harsh northern territories. Years passed. Alara remained at the hearth, which she slowly expanded, her home becoming a green mound on the side of the cliff, a place known for 100 miles as a source of wisdom and aid. She was no longer the outcast girl, but a respected elder, her face lined with the quiet strength of the stone she lived in. The town of Providence thrived, its people tougher and wiser than before. She would often sit outside her door in the evenings, a descendant of shale resting at her feet, and watch the sun set over the valley. She had been given nothing but a barren rock, and from it she had built a life. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in the stone walls and living roofs of the town that had once cast her out. It was a legacy not of clever technique, but of character. It was in the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken, and the profound grace to offer warmth to those who had left her in the cold.